Our next speaker is someone who I haven't had the privilege of meeting yet personally, but has actually inspired me, particularly through a BBC programme he did last year. So he's also had an effect on my life, so I'm very privileged and honoured to be introducing Professor Robert Beckford next to be talking to us. Robert is the director of the newly established Institute of Climate and Social Justice at the University of Winchester. It's not too far away from us, down the A3. And he previously taught at the Queen's Foundation and the University of Birmingham. Robert is a prolific author and, as I say, TV and radio presenter, working in the areas of social criticism and theology. And Robert describes himself as an activist scholar, working to address, confront, and overturn injustice in the African mainland and also in diaspora communities. And Robert has written 8 monographs or books. There's not one at the back there, though, not yet, but you can find them all good bookstores. Exploring the interface of religion, ethnicity, and social justice. His most recent work is an action research project, we do a lot of that here, action research on decoloniality, music and theology, decolonising gospel music, a revolutionary theory practice. Came out this year, in fact, from Bloomsbury.
I'm still working on it.
Still working?
It's going to be later on in the year. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Oh, right. So the ink is still not even wet yet. Well, we've got to let you get on then, so you can go back to your deadline. I'm well aware. And Robert is also, as I mentioned, a BAFTA-winning TV documentary filmmaker. And so, Robert, without further ado, you can read the title yourselves. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I want to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank Alistair for going before me, because I can build on some of the fantastic things that you have said. Let me just situate myself before I start. And there's 2 things that I need to say. I was in Barbados a few months ago with the intention of doing some work on environmental justice, making a radio programme for the BBC. Part of it was on environmental justice, part of it was on the history of the Codrington estate. So when I gave the title for this presentation, I was hoping to use material from Barbados on environmental justice. However, when we got back to the recording studio in London, we realised that the BBC had given us this really crap equipment. And they'd only recorded parts of the week we'd spent in Barbados. We weren't able to recover some of the environmental work that I'd actually done. But don't worry, they're going to compensate us by sending us out to Barbados for another week. It's a tough life being a theologian, I can tell you. Really, it's hard graft. So the subtitle is really only going to be a small part of this presentation. It's the first thing I need to say. Second thing I need to say in terms of situating myself, which will help you understand the work that I do, is if I give a bit of my testimony. Pentecostal, charismatic church tradition. But in my church tradition, testaments are long. I've only got 30 minutes. I'm going to keep it short. But just to situate myself, I was born in Northamptonshire, moved to Coventry in the 1980s, and in late 1970s, I started to move out to Wondrous. They were on the up then. They're still on the up now. I went to play professional football. And they offered me a contract. I was really good, if I don't know. England had won a few World Cups. I played. But my mother did not feel that this is what God wanted for me. So as a good Pentecostal, she started to pray. And in our church tradition, we say if your mother starts to pray for you, she'll be a little bit anxious. That something might actually happen. But then my mum got really excited, and she got the whole church to start praying. So I'm very kind of anxious. And then she got the whole church to start praying and fasting. So I started panicking. What's going on? What's God going to do? That same year in school, I had a new maths teacher. I've written about him in the Times Higher Educational Supplement, in a section there for academics to write about their favourite teachers, Mr. Ralph. He came and he taught us math, but we didn't know math because he was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Sent from London to Coventry to empower the party and to teach the kids in the inner city. So our first class, Mr. Ralph said to me, what do you want to do with him? I still want to play football. He said, that's what they expect of you as a working class African Caribbean man. He said, have you read Malcolm X? It's the math class. So I said, sir, I haven't done any algebra. I'm showing you as Pentecostal. So he brought me in the published by Bernard Mexico. Brought me in C.L.R. James' Black Jacobins on the Haitian Revolution. The following week, we read book after book after book after book, and my interest in football dissipated. My interest in ideas started to develop, you see. Now, my mum was very happy about this, because she said, let's go, the Lord is working! You know, my dad wasn't so happy, because he'd planned on my sports prowess, providing his pension and the beach house back in Montego Bay. So I'm still not quite worried about that. But what that story leads to is two things. I'm a Pentecostal, because my mother prayed. God sent revolutionary Marxists, and that's why I do structural critical work within my scholarship, and that will help you understand some of the themes that emerge from this. Do your work over. It's a word that is a phrase that comes from the work of the great African-American intellectual father of modern sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, who uses that phrase in his 1920 essay called The Soul of Whiteness, and he says to white scholars in America, do your work over. Everything that you thought you knew, stop. You need to redo it. I want to apply that to thinking about issues of environmental justice. I want to work through two things. I want to use the work from Frank Wilson that hasn't come out really well, but has it in terms of the screen. The first book is on Afro-pessimism. Second book is about Afro-optimism. And I want to use these discourses to talk about Black death and Black life. Two dominant discourses informing African diaspora thought at this particular point in time, Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism says, such has been the impact of the slave and colonial world on black life that there is no chance of redemption. It just isn't going to happen. We will always have George Floyd. We'll always have Child Q, because that's the way in which racism works. It is entrenched and embedded in Western ways of thinking and being in the world. It is ontological, according to Wilson. There is, however, an alternative tradition, the Afro-optimism tradition. Afro-optimism argues the opposite. It says, although we know that racialized oppression is normative and it will continue within this world, we can escape. Did you use the microphone? Yes, sorry, there you go. Sorry. We can escape. And one of the key themes within Afro-optimism is the idea of escape, fugitivity, being on the run and getting out of places of oppression. I want to use those two discourses to shape this brief analysis of death, black death, and black life. And obviously the death is following the narrative of the pessimism, the life following some of the themes and narrative of the optimism. So what's black death then? Well, black death is fundamentally about the disproportionate impact of climate change on black and brown bodies. The United Nations tell us that there is a climate change catastrophe every week, and the vast majority of them are happening where? In the southern hemisphere. We often use a variety of ways of explaining this predicament, from the science, from the sociology, to the politics, but what we don't necessarily do well in our context is think about post-colonial. How are these catastrophes related to the longer history of colonial subordination, neo-colonial activity by Western governments and Western companies? We have a real problem now within that for a variety of reasons. You can read Paul Gilroy on this After Empire, where he talks about the fact that we have this post-colonial melancholia. We haven't necessarily dealt with these issues effectively. You can go back to the great work of Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall talked about historical amnesia being a feature of British education, so we don't even know about these things because they're erased from our historical analysis. So I'm going to work through a post-colonial gaze and look at three reasons. First, it comes from Jeremy Williams. Jeremy Williams says this: the reason why these catastrophes are disproportionately impacting black and brown bodies is because of racism. He argues climate change is racist. He bases it on three presuppositions. First, the idea of coloniality, which is a term that emerged from Latin American post-colonial studies, decolonization studies, which says there are continuities from the colonial past that impact us now, particularly around issues of thought, how we think about the world, and how power operates within the world. The second presupposition is social death. Concept that comes out of the Jamaican Harvard intellectual Orlando Patterson's work on black life in America, where he argues that 200 years after the abolition of the slave trade, African Americans, blacks in the diaspora, experienced social death. Social death describes the kinds of marginality, the kinds of institutional work that pushes black bodies to the sideline, the limited opportunities, and what we call now the premature black death connected to state violence. Argues all of this has continuities from the slave and the colonial world, and they lead therefore to black suffering. You can see he didn't go to church much, did he? He didn't get rid of those happy sermons. But anyway, these ideas are not that radical. If you go to Oxfam's website, they incorporate much of this thinking.
Well, nobody is saying hurricanes, heat waves, or rising sea levels are prejudice, but we can't ignore the fact that people who've often been on the front line of climate-related disasters have been people of colour. Sadly, the reality is that the climate crisis has been impacting people of colour for years. There are a lot of complicated reasons as to why. The simple version is this. The lives of people in countries across Africa and Asia, as well as indigenous peoples all over the world, have been deliberately ignored and devalued by massive corporations and countries in the West for centuries. This is happening because a greater value has been placed on money and power than on some human lives. And this is not about the past. The climate crisis is still impacting different groups of people around the world with very different degrees of severity. Today, people who already hold less power around the world, like women and people of colour, are far more likely to experience the catastrophic effects of climate breakdown. When we say catastrophic, we're talking flooding, heat waves, drought, wildfires, rising sea levels, all of which ultimately make it difficult for people affected to access food, shelter, and other basic human needs. So
you know when Oxfam are talking about this and incorporating race discourse into their analysis, that has become quite mainstream. We can't avoid talking about this within the UK. Activists since the 1980s have folded issues of environmental degradation into racial justice. From 1990 to Brixton, activists were talking about air pollution in parts of London where migrants had settled being worse than other parts of London. This is now part of the thinking of the Lord Mayor, where a recent report this year underlined that fact that black and brown bodies in London were disproportionately impacted by pollution within London. 4 years ago, that's actually longer than that, 6 years ago, this issue came to a head with activism by Black Lives Matter at London City Airport.
Mid-morning on Tuesday at London City Airport, protesters with the campaign group Black Lives Matter UK had attached themselves to each other and the structure they brought with them. They'd reportedly crossed the water by dinghy at dawn. But unlike their US counterparts, Black Lives Matter UK weren't protesting about police violence.
If we look at the countries that are most likely to be suffering from the effects of the climate crisis we're facing, they are 7 out of 10 of them are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. Now the people that fly out here, they fly out here frequently because they can. It's frivolous to them. But they are creating the climate crisis that we have. We need to address these inequalities.
The protest ended several hours after it began with police arrests.
Flight cancelled, everybody's going to go in, so yeah, a bit of disruption to the past.
The suited wealth generators of the nearby City of London, with all its tall buildings occupied by the big banks, apparently the focus of this protest, were finally able to go on their way, as were the airport's many other non-executive passengers. Black Lives Matter UK said they chose London City Airport, which they say serves mainly the rich, in order to highlight the issue of environmental inequality. Well, the other issue that they starkly succeeded in highlighting here is a rather large lapse in airport security.
But you see what they're doing here, making the connection between what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa with what's happening in parts of London, that kind of transnational, post-colonial analysis being part of their engagement with the subject, and we'll come back to that later. The other reason why we have this predicament, why? Not only because of issues, the first issue that I mentioned in terms of racism, but also racism with the climate movement. Something that the climate movement is just opening up about. addressing this reality, that it needs to be taken seriously. And we know that the racism movement gets played out in visual ways. Right? A few years ago, that famous photograph where the black activist was cropped, the photographer later apologized for it, but it was kind of symbolic of the way in which the climate justice movement has erased not only its historical past, but also erasing the voices and perspectives of black and brown people. And also research plays a part within this. Very little research, we'll come on to that in a few minutes, in Britain, interplaying, interweaving these issues of race, class, issues around the historical past with environmental issues. Very few texts, there are no research entries addressing these issues at this particular point in time. So that's the why in terms of environmentalism. But there's also a why and how to explain it in terms of Christian theology. We'll move through this quite quickly. Part of the problem is that Christian theology does not have a language or a politics to address issues of race. We know that within Britain. It's my party piece with students. You see, when you get old, you find ways in which you use all these new ideas, Alistair, around the neoliberal university to your advantage, you see. So they said, you've got to do blended learning. Take the classroom notes, that's fantastic. So I said to the students, go to the library and find me every book you can find by a theologian racialized as white in Britain on issues of racial justice over the last 100 years. They go, it takes them 42 minutes. How do I know? Because when they've gone out, I go to the staff room, have a coffee, I read the paper, I come back, they come back in the books. That's the skill, you see. They come back and they say, we've found 2 books. It's actually 1.5. So now, and I say, now find every book you can find by the same demographic, theologians racialized as white, the last 100 years, we've written about animals. Go out. You come back a bit quicker on this one, though, you see, because they've sussed me out. So you get 30 minutes. I power down the room down, go and see him, we hang out for a bit, I come back. They come back and they say to me, 42. I say to them now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against animal theology. I hope that I see my dead rabbit in heaven. I believe that all of creation can be redeemed. However, what does it say about a guild that writes more about animals than its 500-year sojourn with racial terror, racial capitalism, slavery, colonialism? It's dysfunctional. How did we get into that mess? Well, Willie Jennings from Yale, in my new film, which is screening currently, helps us understand this predicament when he talks about whiteness being ingrained in the colonial enterprise.
The first element were Christians in the old world, of what we would now call Europe. They understood themselves to be the people of God who replaced Israel as the people of God. That God had chosen Israel, then because of Israel's quote-unquote rejection of Jesus Christ the Messiah, God rejected them in this way of thinking. And when God rejected Israel, God turned to those who had accepted Jesus Christ, thus the church. And the church became the people of God. Now, why this is so important is because with that idea of replacing Israel, they saw themselves at the very center of God's activity in the world. So when we come to what many historians have called the age of discovery, which we always have to be careful with that statement, because the indigenous and native peoples around the world, they don't see themselves as ever having been discovered. But let's just use that language. When they came to the new worlds of what we would call the Americas, Pacific Islands, China, and the sub-Saharan parts of Africa, one, they were coming there because of the providence of God, the plan of God. God wanted them there. And because God brought them there, something else was going to result. God had brought them there to offer to indigenous peoples, native peoples, the truth of Christianity. But now that truth of Christianity was not just a set of ideas. God was also giving them responsibility for the land and for the animals and for the environment. so that they were going to mature the people and mature the environment at the same time. Element number 3, they were in a powerful position to name who these people were. So the naming of them has to do with the way they describe who they were and describe themselves in relationship to who they were. And in that scale of existence, whiteness stands at one end as the kind of highest end of human maturity, productivity, and transformation. People being aligned not only with what God wants, but with who they should actually be as fully developed human beings.
So do you see the connection here that Willie Jennings is making between whiteness, Christianity, coloniality? We accept that colonialism plays a role in environmental degradation in the southern hemisphere, then Christianity is bound up with this process and therefore needs to do some work in disentangling itself from it. A good example of this is with the Codrington estate, what I was hoping to do the work on. Codrington estate, which was bequeathed to the Church of England through its missionary arm, the United Society for Propagation of the Gospel, in 1710. The church takes it over, runs it for 120 years as a going concern, which is problematic in itself. It is hidden from the history, but it's part of the historical amnesia coming to the Church of England. Branding women's breasts with the name Society for 120 years doesn't really go down well at the Eucharist. It happened out there at Barbados. But they also got involved in the destruction of the land, the soil erosion, the coastal erosion, part of that process, and entangling theology, environmentalism, colonialism. You can see it being played out in contemporary Barbados. So this is the Black Death. I'm going to move on to the life because, in the Pentecostal church tradition, you like the resurrection part of it, so we'll move on to that. Or just to say there's lots of reading around environment and empire if you want to engage in this. Corey Ross's book is really, really helpful in terms of ecology and power in the age of empire. And also if you want to do some more work around thinking how theology needs to disentangle itself from whiteness, there's some great work that's been done in North America. James Perkinson's book on outing white theology is a classic understanding this relationship, and more recently Eric Reed's book on the religion of white supremacy in the United States, but much of it can be applied to the dynamics of Christianity and the Christian theology within the UK. Right, so what's to be done about it? What's the pathways back to life then? Obviously, back to life, soul to soul, see the connection. I thought it was London. I thought you'd all get into this. I'm not going to play you back to life and soul to soul. So what are the ways back to, how do we then move from death, social death, to life? Well, we need to be cautious here because much of the thinking around black life is cautionary. And it's cautionary because it recognises that liberal approaches to social and environmental transformation haven't worked for black and brown bodies. Liberalism just reproduces the asymmetric social relations rather than radically challenging them. So black philosophers have been telling us for the last 20 years, radical approaches are the only option for ensuring that there will be sufficient change to make a difference. It's kind of cautionary. We're looking for life. We recognise that this business as usual, in terms of the same old tropes, the same old categories of thought within the Christian tradition, may not necessarily work. Two things we have to do then in response then. The first is, if we have a colonized tradition, we need to decolonize it. And we need to decolonize it by thinking about how we produce knowledge about the environment. How do we produce knowledge for education within the classroom? Whose knowledge are we using? How are we positioning the knowledge that we do use in relation to issues of power and histories of power? So we need to think about decolonizing educational research into environmentalism. We need to have another look at the textbooks, have another look at the course that we're running, and ask critical questions about power. Whose ideas? How do we place these in relation to this colonial history and these other institutions that are deep in power? One of the ways in which we're doing this in my centre at the moment is we're going back into Caribbean culture and history, because the first vegans ever met were Rastafarians, the first environmentalists ever met were Rastafarians. But I didn't start what we're talking about at a particular point in time. So we're, again, thinking about where do we get the knowledge from for this? How do we do what Foucault requires, interact subordinated knowledges? The other thing we need to do is think about our theology. If the theology is bound up with whiteness, how do we disentangle it? One pathway into this is to have an intersectional approach to theology, weaving together issues of race, class, gender, able-bodiedness, human sexuality, to ask critical questions of faith, questions, equally critical questions about the environment. One way in which this has been done in modern research is the eco-womanist movement, which weaves issues of gender, race, black women's experience into environmental concerns and environmental liberation. An intersectional approach to climate justice, therefore, for example, has to tackle race and gender inequalities, has to look at who's vulnerable and the vulnerability of particular people. It has to be deeply connected to politics and liberation of politics and radical politics, because the liberal ones don't work. It just reproduces the social order. Got to be contextual. Also has to think about how we deal with issues of resilience, because we know that we're not necessarily going to hit the targets that we need to hit to make radical progress. One of the ways which I've attempted to do this within my own work is through the use of popular culture and trying to use the choir tradition of the Black Church in particular to articulate some of these messages. So at COP26, I worked with Karen Dixon and the Kingdom Choir. Do you know anything about the choir tradition in Britain, particularly conservative? So it took some work to take them out of their comfort zone. At COP26, they reversioned the only environmental justice song ever written by a soul singer. Well, we could say Michael Jackson, they were not allowed to talk about justice. So, Marvin Gaye, Mercy Mercy Me, 1970, The Ecology, they did their version of that to play a snippet. It takes them a while to set up. Or the other thing, the volume is red on that. There you go. If you want to go look at it. So where does this then leave us then? Well, what does it mean in terms of escape if we're thinking about black life? What does fugitivity mean? In the Caribbean tradition, that fugitivity is a word used by the Afro-optimist tradition. Caribbean people like to think that the African Americans stole everything from them. So we have our own version of this, which is Maronite, the Maroon tradition in Jamaica. If you know Caribbean history, enslaved people took to the hills in Jamaica, met up with many of the indigenous people that weren't exterminated by Christopher Columbus, as they call him in Jamaica, Christopher Columbus, set up their own communities, escaped, became fugitives, and developed a fugitive culture. What does this fugitive culture mean? If we have to escape the norms in terms of our thinking, in terms of our activity, nothing but a huge implication for research. Basic problem being, there isn't any. Why is there so little research on colonialism, post-colonialism, race, and environmentalism within Britain? It's tragic. We're not even researching it. We can't even evaluate it, can't even ask ourselves critical questions about what we're doing. Big problem. Universities. Again, if the universities aren't conducting the research, how do they resist a liberal agenda, which we know historically doesn't lead to the kind of radical change that liberates black and brown bodies? It has implications then for theology and spirituality. If we do not decolonize our theology and our religious traditions, then we run the risk of simply reproducing the limitations of the past. So, great words of Du Bois. Do your work over. It doesn't work for us. Do your work over. Thank you.